So we're going to continue our discussion of gender and race here by talking about some of the views of various philosophers on this subject. And Judith Butler is probably one of the most famous feminist philosophers nowadays. And she talks about how gender is performance. For her, gender is something someone does, not something someone is. So the things we do, which she calls practices, which can be really anything: cleaning, shopping, working, even just interacting with our family or interacting with other people, count as part of what makes us whatever gender we are. So we are encouraged to do certain practices by the gender norms. So females are encouraged to become nurses, for example, and not necessarily to become doctors. And so it's not as though we necessarily always choose these things thinking that that's what we want to do. In some cases, we are, let's say, coerced or at least encouraged to do certain things based on our gender. So gender is also embodied, she says, so we tend to do things to our bodies that are expected given our gender. So we might grow long hair or get our hair curled or paint our nails or work out at the gym, depending on what we see the gender norms as sort of encouraging us to do. So to her, gender isn't something that we are born with. It's rather something that we are born into and that then we accept and allow it to shape the way we live our lives. So then the things that we do, because of social pressure or other reasons, these practices then inform our view of ourselves as well as others' views of us. So if we engage in masculine practices, we'll form an image of ourselves as masculine, and so on and so forth. So it's like we create this gender, but not on our own. Again, it's partly pressure from society. Societal norms compel us to perform these practices, whatever they are, because of what we are biologically or what people think we are biologically. So, and the accepted practices for particular genders do change, but that doesn't mean that there are no accepted practices for the genders anymore. So there always are practices that women are supposed to do and men are supposed to do, even though those things change over time, she says. And then some philosophers like Tina Chanter point out that the same kind of norms also apply to race, and we'll see that more in a minute. So again, even though Butler says the gender norms may change, she calls it resignification, there are always this opposition between male and female. So even though women might be allowed to wear pants now and it might be acceptable, it doesn't mean that they have become masculine or they're allowed to be masculine. It's that we can wear pants and still be feminine now. So and it's not as though like wearing men's pants is still going to seem like you're being masculine in an unacceptable way. So it's still the case that you have to go to the women's section and buy the women's pants if you're going to be considered feminine. And again, we embody and we absorb these gender norms and they become sort of part of us, she says. And Butler realizes that we can't just cast these things off and suddenly decide that we're not going to be feminine anymore, or we're not going to be masculine anymore. It's not that easy because it ends up becoming part of our personality in a sense. And she said we can't sort of dig down and find this pure selfhood that isn't affected by these things. That we can consciously question our assumptions and society's expectations, but a lot of this stuff has sort of been built into us. So again, why is this a problem? Why is it a big deal? Who cares? She says part of the reason we should care about this is that this strict bifurcation in male and female means that anyone who's different, who deviates, who doesn't do it right, who doesn't conform will be labeled as wrong or unnatural, and it bothers people, and they don't like people like that. It makes them uncomfortable. And so then these attitudes have real world consequences for people who don't follow the gender norms. They can be discriminated against in various ways, and there can even be laws targeting them, such as these transgender athlete bans and limits on gender affirming care. And there's a lot of other things that happen, that discrimination that comes out of this idea that you have to be one way or the other. But obviously, too, gender expectations can limit our freedom to be individuals. If we feel like we have to live our lives according to gender norms, that will constrain our opportunities. And again, she says it's not that biology or some kind of natural thing makes women have to be caregivers and men providers and protectors. It's rather this heterosexual matrix that we talked about earlier, this arbitrary social construction that's set up to encourage us into this heterosexual sort of bifurcation. And if we had the freedom to choose what we wanted to do without the influence of these gender norms, we might choose differently. So is somewhat similar with race. Lewis Gordon says that, Black people have historically served as projection of white needs and desires, and that there's this bifurcation there too, and this expectation of what people should do, that Black people should be subordinate and have no subjectivity, is somewhat similar to the way that women are expected to do these things. And too, when Black people don't conform to the way they're sort of expected to, they can be subject to discrimination and violence and so on. And this system, unlike the gender system, is set up, according to Rubin and Butler and others, to keep this system of heterosexual system in place. For race, it's about keeping colonization and economic models in place that people have vested interest in. So some philosophers have said things like that racial identification limits individual autonomy in the same way that gender can limit individual autonomy by mandating that members of racial groups act according to behavioral norms for their group. So Black people are supposed to act a certain way, white people are supposed to act a certain way, other races have their own expectations as well. And he says that we have to keep racial identity in a sense so that we can, again, understand the experiences that people go through, but we also have to break out of it in order to not allow the tyranny of this expectation to overrun our lives and make us choose things we might not choose otherwise. So Tommy Shelby addresses this by saying, okay, well, there's classical Black nationalism and pragmatic Black nationalism, and he says that classical Black nationalism is based on the idea of there's this organic Black identity. There's actually something that it is to be Black, whereas pragmatic Black nationalism is concerned with, okay, outsiders in society have made Black people into this group, and we're only keeping the group to sort of recognize that. And then Shelby argues that rather than other ways of trying to equalize things, we should use something like Rawls's original position, which again, some people are against that because the idea that we can sort of erase color and ignore it, or erase economic differences and ignore them, is maybe not quite practical or the right way to set the playing field more level.